This is the story of a man who was handed a warning in an envelope, had it framed, and hung it on his wall like a trophy. The warning told him exactly what was coming: the date, the hour, the floor, the room. It named the thing that would be taken. It gave him weeks to prepare. He used every one of those weeks. He hired additional security, installed new cameras, ran drills with his overnight team, and personally verified that the 2 key cards required to open his private office were accounted for at all times. He did everything a man with his resources could do. And on Thursday at 11 p.m., while 6 security guards were sweeping floors on his explicit orders, the gentleman walked through the one corridor nobody was watching, into the one room that was supposed to be impenetrable, and removed the documents that proved everything. The framed letter was still on the wall when Reginald Whitmore arrived Friday morning. It took him 4 minutes standing in his own office, staring at his own desk, before the full weight of what he was looking at reached him. Not the missing documents, the piece of paper left in their place. That was what did it. That was the moment the warning stopped being a conversation piece and became something else entirely. The gentleman has a code. It has nothing to do with the law, which in his experience tends to bend in the direction of whoever can afford the best bending. It has nothing to do with revenge, which is a feeling and therefore unreliable. The code is simpler than either of those things. People who build systems designed to extract from others without consequence should understand, at least once, what it feels like when the extraction runs the other way. Not financially, not violently, precisely. The thing taken is always the thing that matters most to the person who built the system. And in Reginald Whitmore's case, what mattered most was not the money. The money was already gone, already moved, already insulated behind structures that would take a decade to unwind in court. What mattered was the proof, the internal models, the projected numbers that existed before the acquisition closed, before the first press release went out, before the first community meeting where Whitmore Pemberton Capital's representatives told 3 separate towns that they were committed to the long-term health of the regional hospital network they had just purchased. If you've ever received a warning you didn't take seriously, if you've ever looked at something that told you exactly what was coming and decided it couldn't possibly mean what it said, stay with this. Because the most interesting part of what happened that Thursday night is not what the gentleman did. It's what Whitmore did first, and how every single thing Whitmore did to protect himself became, piece by piece, the architecture of his own undoing. If that's the kind of story you want to follow, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe. The gentleman's game is exactly what it sounds like. Reginald Whitmore had been in private equity for 23 years. He had a Wharton MBA that he referenced in conversation with the ease of someone who had long since decided it was simply a fact about the world, like the altitude of a city or the depth of a lake. He had built Whitmore Pemberton Capital from a 2-partner operation in a River North walk-up into a firm managing north of $4 billion in assets, with a glass and steel office on the 38th floor of a building on Wacker Drive, where the windows faced the river, and the light in the afternoon came in flat and clean and made everything look like it had been designed to be photographed. He was not a careless man. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had spent 2 decades making decisions inside a system that rewarded a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that could read a balance sheet the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, identify exactly where the value was stored, and extract it through mechanisms that were technically legal, every time, without exception. The hospital acquisition had followed the same logic as everything else Whitmore Pemberton had ever done. Meridian Regional Health Partners, a network of 7 hospitals serving a swath of northern Illinois that included 3 mid-sized cities and a collection of smaller towns that had been losing population and tax base for 15 years, had come onto the market in a state of genuine distress. The previous ownership group had mismanaged its debt structure, allowed its facilities' maintenance budgets to erode, and watched its best physicians migrate to larger systems in Chicago and Peoria. It was, by any measure, a struggling enterprise. Whitmore Pemberton acquired it for $610 million, announced a comprehensive revitalization plan, held community meetings in 6 locations, issued a press release that quoted Whitmore himself, saying that health care was a public trust, and that his firm took that responsibility seriously. The sale-leaseback arrangement came 8 months later. Meridian Regional's real estate, the hospital buildings themselves, the medical office complexes, the parking structures, was sold to a separate Whitmore Pemberton entity for $340 million and immediately leased back to the operating company at rates that, over 10 years, would cost the hospital network considerably more than the buildings had sold for. The $340 million went to Whitmore Pemberton's investors as a return. The debt stayed with Meridian Regional. The lease payments joined the debt service on the balance sheet, and the balance sheet began, quietly and systematically, to deteriorate. 18 months after the sale-leaseback closed, Whitmore Pemberton filed for a structured wind-down of Meridian Regional's 3 smallest hospitals. The press release used the word unavoidable. Whitmore testified before an Illinois state legislative committee and used it again. The committee asked questions for 2 hours. Whitmore answered all of them. He was precise, patient, and thorough. He cited market forces, demographic trends, reimbursement rate changes, and the broader challenges facing rural health care in the American Midwest. He was not lying about any of those things. Those things were all real. What he did not mention, what did not appear in any of the documents submitted to the committee, what existed only in a set of internal models prepared by his firm's analytics team 14 months before the acquisition closed, was that the wind-down of those 3 hospitals had been projected as the most likely outcome before Whitmore Pemberton had signed anything. Before the community meetings, before the press release about public trust. The models showed it clearly. They showed the lease rates, the debt load, the projected reimbursement trajectory, and the break-even analysis for each facility. They showed which hospitals would survive and which would not. They showed the timeline. The analytics team had done their job. The models were accurate. And Whitmore had looked at them, understood them, and proceeded. He kept the physical copies in a lateral file cabinet in his private office. The cabinet had a mechanical lock, a decision he had made deliberately years earlier after a data breach at a competitor firm had cost that firm both money and reputation. Nothing sensitive stayed digital. Paper could be controlled. Paper could be locked. Paper could be accounted for. He had 2 key cards for his office door, both biometrically linked to his thumbprint as a secondary verification, and he kept one on his person and one in a small lockbox in his home office in Kenilworth. The building's security team ran overnight coverage with 6 personnel, a camera system that covered every corridor and elevator lobby on every floor, and a check-in protocol that required each guard to log their position every 20 minutes via a handheld scanner that transmitted to a central console. He was, in other words, a man who understood risk and had built his professional life around managing it. When the letter arrived, certified mail, hand-addressed, no return address, postmarked from a mailbox on the near north side, he read it twice, set it on his desk, and picked up the phone. He called his head of building security, a former Chicago PD detective named Brannigan, who had worked for Whitmore Pemberton for 6 years, and who had, in that time, developed a comprehensive understanding of what his employer considered a serious threat and what he considered theater. Whitmore read him the letter over the phone. Brannigan was quiet for a moment. Then he said it sounded like someone who watched too many movies. Whitmore agreed. He also told Brannigan to treat it as real anyway. That conversation was the first move the gentleman had anticipated. The letter said Thursday. It said 11 p.m. It said the 38th floor. It said the cabinet. It said the models. It was specific in the way that things are specific when the person writing them has already accounted for every variable and has no reason to be vague. Whitmore read it as theater, because specificity, in his experience, was a performance. Real threats were quiet. Real threats didn't announce themselves with a date and a time and a room number. Real threats came in the form of a regulatory subpoena or a whistleblower or a journalist with a source inside your own firm. This was a letter. This was someone who wanted to be taken seriously and had chosen an unconvincing method of demanding it. He had it framed the following week. Dark wood frame, glass front, mounted on the wall behind his desk between a photograph of his family at their Nantucket house and a framed copy of a Forbes profile from 4 years earlier that had called him one of the most disciplined capital allocators in the Midwest. He showed it to 3 colleagues before Thursday arrived. He described it as the most creative piece of hate mail he'd ever received. One of them laughed. 2 of them asked if he'd reported it to anyone. He said Brannigan knew. He said Brannigan had it handled. Brannigan did have it handled. He added 2 cameras to the 38th floor corridor, one covering the elevator lobby, one covering the hallway outside Whitmore's office. He added a second guard to the overnight shift and briefed the entire team on Thursday's timeline, establishing a floor-by-floor sweep protocol to begin at 10:45 p.m. and run until midnight. He coordinated with the building's management company to verify that all vendor access credentials active for Thursday night were current and legitimate. He reviewed the cleaning crew roster, the HVAC maintenance schedule, and the list of after-hours access requests filed for that week. Everything checked out. He filed a brief internal security memo documenting the threat and the response measures. He gave Whitmore a copy on Wednesday afternoon. Whitmore read it, nodded, and said it looked thorough. It was thorough. That was not the problem. The specific, elegant, quietly devastating problem was that thoroughness, in this case, was exactly what the gentleman needed. There is a vendor access credential in the building's system for a company called Meridian Facility Services, not the hospital network, a different Meridian, a commercial cleaning contractor that had held a service contract with the building since before the current property management company took over, before the current security director was hired, before Brannigan had ever walked through the lobby. The contract was grandfathered into the current system during a transition 3 years earlier. The credential allowed overnight access to the service elevator bank and the supply corridors on floors 20 through 42. It appeared in the building's access log the way old infrastructure always appears, as background, as given, as a thing that has always been there and therefore does not require examination. Brannigan's review confirmed it as current and legitimate, which it was. The company existed. The contract existed. The access credential was valid. The supervisor badged in at 9:47 p.m. He wore a gray uniform with the Meridian Facility Services logo on the chest, carried a laminated ID, and pushed a cleaning cart through the service entrance with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this route 100 times. The overnight desk attendant logged the credential and went back to his screen. The camera above the service entrance recorded a man in a gray uniform pushing a cart. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m. Now, and this is the part that will stay with you. Think about what Brannigan's sweep protocol looked like from the outside. 6 security personnel, moving floor by floor starting at 10:45, logging their positions every 20 minutes, covering the elevator lobbies and main corridors with deliberate, documented thoroughness. It was exactly the kind of operation that fills a building with visible, accounted for movement. Guards in the lobbies, guards in the stairwells, guards checking in on their scanners. The 38th floor main corridor had 2 new cameras and a guard due to pass through at 10:45 on the dot. The service elevator bank, which connected the supply corridors on the back side of the building, had the same foot traffic it always had on a Thursday night, which was none. At 10:45, Brannigan's team began their sweep. Every guard moved to their assigned position. The 38th floor main corridor was covered. The elevator lobby was covered. The camera feeds showed exactly what they were supposed to show. In the 11 minutes it took the sweep to complete its first full rotation and for the guard assigned to the service corridor to reach his check-in point, the service elevator on the 38th floor opened, a cart was moved into the supply corridor, and a lateral file cabinet in a private office was accessed through a method that the cabinet's manufacturer had documented in a 2019 technical bulletin, and that Whitmore's facilities team had never acted on because the bulletin had been filed and not read. The documents were gone by 11:03. The cart was back in the service elevator by 11:06. The credential logged an exit at 11:31. After the cleaning route was completed on 3 other floors exactly as the contract specified. The exit timestamp was unremarkable. The building's access log showed a normal Thursday night. What the gentleman left on Whitmore's desk was a single sheet of paper, printed in clean 12-point type, centered on the page. No letterhead, no signature. 3 columns, the name of each town where a hospital had closed, the date of closure, and a number. The number was the count of patients who had lost their primary care provider as a result. Addison, 1,847. Cortland, 2,203. Millbrook, 934. Below the 3 rows, a single line. Total, 4,084. Nothing else. No note, no explanation, no demand. The framed letter was still on the wall. Reginald Whitmore arrived at his office at 7:14 a.m. on Friday. He had slept well. He had come in early because he had a call with a London investor at 8 Hayes and liked to be settled before the building filled up. He took the elevator to 38, badged through the main door, walked down the corridor to his office, unlocked it with his keycard and his thumb, and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as he had left it the night before. The desk was clear. The framed Forbes profile was on the wall. The framed letter was on the wall. He set his bag down. He went to the cabinet. He used his key. The lock turned the way it always turned. The drawer opened the way it always opened. The files were gone. He stood there for a moment. He looked at the drawer. He looked at the lock. He looked at the key in his hand, as if the key might offer some explanation for why it had worked correctly and the files were still gone. He looked at the room. He looked at the desk. He saw the piece of paper. He read it. He read it again. He read the numbers. Addison, 1,847. Cortland, 2,203. Millbrook, 934. Total, 4,984. Later, the people who spoke to him in the hours that followed would describe the same thing, a quality of stillness that was not calm. Brannigan arrived at 7:40 after an urgent call from Whitmore's assistant and found him standing at his desk, the piece of paper in his hand, not moving. Brannigan asked what had happened. Whitmore handed him the paper without speaking. Brannigan read it, looked up, looked at the cabinet, looked at the room, and began asking questions. Whitmore answered them. He answered them in the correct order, with accurate details, in complete sentences. But Brannigan said afterward that it was like talking to someone who was answering from a very long distance. Like the words were arriving from somewhere else, and Whitmore was simply passing them through. The framed letter on the wall behind him, the filing cabinet open and empty in front of him, the piece of paper with 4,984 on it in his hand. This was the moment the warning became real. Not a conversation piece, not theater, not the most creative hate mail he'd ever received. A promise that had been made and kept precisely on schedule, in the room he had been told it would happen, at the hour he had been given, using the security sweep he himself had ordered as the instrument of his own exposure. Brannigan reviewed the camera footage for 6 hours. He found the credential log. He found the service elevator timestamps. He found a man in a gray uniform pushing a cart, face angled away from every camera at every moment with the natural, uncontrived ease of someone who has spent time understanding where cameras are. There was nothing in the footage that constituted evidence of anything except a cleaning crew supervisor doing a Thursday night route. The credential was valid. The contract was real. The access was authorized. He called the building's property management company. They confirmed the Meridian Facility Services contract. He called Meridian Facility Services. The company confirmed the route. The supervisor who had done the 38th floor that night had been with the company for 2 years, had a clean record, and was not, when Brannigan reached him, the person who had been in this building on Thursday night. Someone had known the route. Someone had known the credential. Someone had known the contract number, and the access timing, and the camera positions, and the sweep protocol that Brannigan himself had designed as a response to a letter that had told them with complete accuracy what was coming. Whitmore called his attorney at 9:15 a.m. He explained what had happened. His attorney was quiet for a long moment and then asked a question that Whitmore had already been turning over in his own mind for 2 hours. What exactly had been taken? Whitmore told him. His attorney was quiet again. Then he asked another question. Were there any copies? Whitmore said no. He had made sure of that. His attorney said that was something at least. Whitmore said yes. He said it quietly, without the conviction the words usually carried. Because here is the thing about a document that proves something and then disappears. It doesn't stop proving it. The models existed. The projections existed. The people who built them knew what they showed. The analytics team that had worked on the Meridian acquisition still worked at Whitmore Pemberton Capital, or had moved to other firms, or had moved on entirely. But they existed, and they had done the work, and they knew what the work had shown. The documents being gone did not make the knowledge gone. It made it ungovernable. It made it something Whitmore could no longer locate or monitor or control. It was out in the world now, in a form he couldn't see, held by someone whose name he didn't know, who had told him exactly what they were going to do and had done it, and had left him a piece of paper with 4,984 on it and nothing else. He could not call the police without explaining what had been taken and why it mattered. He could not file an insurance claim without documentation. He could not issue a statement without raising questions he had spent years ensuring nobody was positioned to ask. He could not do anything that a man in his position would normally do when something had been taken from him, because every avenue available to him required him to first explain what the thing was, and the explanation was the problem. The framed letter stayed on the wall for 11 days. His assistant asked once if he wanted it taken down. He said no. He didn't explain why. She didn't ask again. On the 12th day, It was gone. Nobody mentioned it. In the weeks that followed, a woman named Denise Okafor, who had worked as a charge nurse at the Cortland facility for 14 years and had been part of a small, underfunded advocacy group that had been trying, without success, to draw attention to the circumstances of the hospital closures, received an unmarked envelope at the address of the church basement where the group held its monthly meetings. Inside was a letter, 2 paragraphs, no signature, written in the same clean type as the paper left on Whitmore's desk. The first paragraph described in general terms the existence of internal documents that had been prepared before the acquisition closed and that contradicted the public account of why the hospitals had failed. The second paragraph named 3 journalists, one at the Chicago Tribune, one at ProPublica, one at a healthcare industry publication, who had been following the Meridian story and who, the letter suggested, might find a detailed account of the advocacy group's experience worth hearing. Denise read the letter 3 times. She passed it around the table at the next meeting. The group had 7 members. They discussed it for an hour. They decided to make the calls. The gentleman was in Milwaukee when the Tribune piece ran, 6 weeks later. He read it on his phone over coffee, in a diner on the east side of the city where nobody knew him, and the coffee was bad, and the morning light came in through windows that needed cleaning. The piece was careful. No documents, no sources willing to go on record, but a detailed timeline of the acquisition and the closures and the gap between what had been said publicly and what the numbers suggested had been known privately. It named Whitmore Pemberton Capital 17 times. It named Reginald Whitmore 4 times. It quoted Denise Okafor, identified as a former Cortland charge nurse and community advocate, saying that the people in these towns had deserved the truth before the decisions were made, not after. He finished his coffee. He left a tip that was larger than the bill, which was a habit, not a statement. He put on his coat and walked out into a gray Milwaukee morning and thought about what he had expected to feel and what he actually felt, which were not quite the same thing. He had expected something cleaner, something that resolved. The documents were gone, the letter had been sent, the calls had been made, the story had run. In a movie, that would be the end. In practice, it was a beginning of something slower and less certain, an investigation that might go somewhere or might not, a regulatory inquiry that might be opened or might not, a reputational cost that might accumulate into something consequential, or might be absorbed the way men like Whitmore had always absorbed reputational costs, with lawyers and time and the institutional memory of a press cycle that moved on. He didn't know which it would be. He had done what he came to do. The rest was not his to control. What stayed with him, walking along a street in Milwaukee with his hands in his coat pockets, was not the operation. Operations ended. What stayed was the number, 4,984. The clean arithmetic of it. Not an abstraction, not a policy outcome, not a market correction. 4,084 people who had gone looking for a doctor and found a closed building. He had put that number on Whitmore's desk because he wanted Whitmore to hold it, to stand in his own office with his own key in his hand and hold the number of people his models had never counted as people. Whether Whitmore would carry it or set it down was not something the gentleman could determine. He had delivered it. The delivery was the work. Denise Okafor, for her part, kept the unmarked letter in a folder in her kitchen. She didn't know who had sent it. She had her theories, none of them verifiable. What she knew was that for 3 years, the advocacy group had been trying to get someone to pay attention to a story that everyone with the power to amplify it had found too complicated or too risky or too expensive to touch. And that one morning, an envelope had appeared with 2 paragraphs and 3 names, and that she had made 3 phone calls, and that 6 weeks later, the name of her hospital and her town, and the number of people who had lost their care had appeared in a newspaper that people read. That was not everything. It was not justice in any formal sense. It was a door that had been closed and was now, in some small and uncertain way, open. She thought about who had sent the letter sometimes, in the way you think about something you know you can't resolve. She had no answer. She kept the folder anyway. There are things you watch happen in this country and you file them away because there is nowhere to put them. The system that was supposed to stop what happened to those 3 hospitals is the same system that approved the acquisition, accepted the testimony, asked questions for 2 hours, and then moved on. The mechanisms that exist to hold people like Reginald Whitmore accountable are, in many cases, staffed by people who used to work for firms like Whitmore Pemberton Capital and will work for them again. This is not a conspiracy, it is a structure. Structures don't require conspiracies. They just require everyone to keep doing their job the way their job was designed to be done. The gentleman does not operate inside that structure. He operates in the space it leaves open, the gap between what the system is supposed to do and what it actually does, between the public account and the internal model, between the warning that was framed and hung on a wall and the moment a man stood in his own office and finally understood that the warning had been real. What he took from Whitmore was paper. What he left was a number. The number was already true before he put it on the desk. He just made sure it was in the room. The most important thing Reginald Whitmore did was frame the letter, not because it was arrogant, though it was, but because it told the gentleman everything he needed to know about how Whitmore processed threats. A man who frames a warning and hangs it on his wall is a man who has spent so long operating inside a system built around his security that he has confused the system with reality. He has won every game he's ever played. He assumes the game continues on the same terms. He builds his defenses with the logic of someone who has never genuinely lost, and that logic has a blind spot in it, and the blind spot is always the same. The thing he's never had to think about because the system always handled it for him. If you've stayed to the end of this one, you know what that blind spot looked like on a Thursday night in Chicago. You know what it looks like when a plan accounts for every defense and uses every defense. You know what 4,084 looks like on a piece of paper on a desk with a framed letter still on the wall above it. Leave a comment with this. Have you ever been warned about something and decided it wasn't serious and been wrong? Not wrong the way Whitmore was wrong, but wrong in the smaller private way that most of us are wrong sometimes, when we mistake the familiarity of a situation for control of it. What did it take to make the warning real? Like this episode if the number stayed with you. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. The gentleman's game is always the same game. The board is always different. And the warning is always real.